Hi guys, I'm Mike and this is F1 Fanatics. Welcome back to another F1 Worldwide The Fan podcast, guys, and we have our first returning guest to the podcast, and that is going to be Jason. So Jason, welcome back.
Great, hi, good to be back again.
Hi, it's great to have you back on. And Jason was actually invited back on because it was a video idea. We had this quiz called Fanmula 1, which was going to be F1 Fanatics' first inaugural one. But turns out, obviously the first episode of the F1 Mastermind would have come out after this, because it turns out if you put a load of people into a Skype group chat, the audio doesn't turn out to be too great. So it was kind of not great to see the light today. But the award for winning that was a place on the F1 Worldwide podcast. I know all you guys are jealous at home. It's a great prize. It's what Jason was working for his entire life. So he's back. He's back, and surprisingly, obviously last time we spoke about his love of Michael Schumacher and how his growing love of Charles Leclerc is coming into play. But today we're going to talk about Lewis Hamilton, arguably the guy who has taken on his mantelpiece, although it was meant to be Fernando Alonso and Kimi Raikkonen. But yeah, Lewis Hamilton today. So Jason, we're going to start off at the beginning, in the McLaren days, in what was an absolutely incredible rookie season. So where do we start? His rookie season. What were your thoughts on that season, Jace?
Well, I think everyone was kind of blown away from the very start. I mean, you sort of, before the season, obviously there was a lot of hype around Lewis Hamilton. Obviously, I think he was on ITV a lot sort of before he even got to F1, and sort of everyone knew, oh, he's a talent. You know, he won GP2. But I think you sort of come into the season, you think you're up against Fernando Alonso, who's won the last two championships back to back, is sort of the king of Formula One now that Michael Schumacher's gone. And I think everyone kind of expected, Lewis will just, you know, first season, he'll just slot into line, you know, be the number two, maybe win a couple of races. And yet, I think what stood out to me was from the very outset, it was very clear that wasn't going to be the case, because what do you know, the first race, Australia, first corner, round the outside of Alonso, unbelievable move. And you sort of, I think at that moment, everyone went, whoa, okay, what's going on here? And from there, the momentum was just insane. Obviously, I think podiums for the first 9 races of the season and back-to-back victories in North America. And I think, yeah, the momentum, I've never seen anyone jump into Formula One in that manner and just immediately be one of the best, if not the best, you know, on the grid. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, it was just incredible. I mean, I've got the stats up here in terms of in the first 9 races of the 17 race season, he finished on the podium, which is incredible. And look, let's not beat around the bush here. The McLaren was probably the best car on the grid that season, and it was only the infighting with Fernando Alonso and himself, and obviously Spygate, one of the biggest scandals in F1 history, that marred the season, that stopped either of them winning the championship that year. But only 5 races he didn't get on the podium in total. So, you know, well over half the races he's finished on the podium in his first season. And yes, he had like testing behind him. And yes, compared to a lot of drivers who've come into the sport, not many drivers jump into a championship capable winning car in their first season. I mean, Jacques Villeneuve's is the only one that kind of comes to mind, and he also had a very good rookie season. But there's something about Lewis Hamilton's that seems quite special and kind of resides in people's memory, and it was a statement. You know, the 2-time world champion was moving to arguably the best car on the grid to win his 3rd world championship, and you know, this young kid's come in and he's making sure that he's there, and he's like, you know what, I'm not going to be pushed over by you. I'm here to fight. It was just incredible to see, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think what stood out sort of incredibly as well was the fact that he sort of brought out a side of Alonso that people had never seen before. Obviously, Alonso, we knew he was a feisty character, we knew he was a fiery character, but the way that, you know, Hamilton came along and slowly but surely begun to rattle him. Obviously, I think Monaco was the first tester where Hamilton was obviously pushing Alonso the whole race and sort of saying to him, look, I can go faster, I can go faster. And they obviously told him to hold position. And then obviously from there, obviously the famous one, obviously in America, where the two of them, Alonso was driving up alongside the pit wall to make his point heard that why am I not being allowed to go through? Why can't I win this race? And obviously it all sort of came to a head in Hungary in qualifying, where obviously Alonso did something that it's arguably one of his infamous moments in Formula One, sort of the deliberate blocking in the pit lane to ensure that he was able to get a final lap in the third part of qualifying and Hamilton wasn't. And I think everyone was not shocked, but it was incredible how a rookie would come along and completely dismantle the character of someone who, as we say, was the figure of Formula One at that time, was considered the best driver on the grid.
Yeah, absolutely. And with Lewis, there were a number of factors that unsettled Fernando and that team. I think the car didn't quite kind of fit to how it kind of had used to at the Renault days. He was coming into a new team, getting used to the new way they worked. And then suddenly, there was this new kid on the block that he'd heard about, but he was like, you know what, he's a rookie in this season. I'll have the favour as a two-time world champion. And slowly as Lewis's performances, went through the season, and I think it was after Hungary that pretty much McLaren, Alonso was dead to them. I'm pretty sure Ron Dennis was furious after that race and that incident, and everything went behind trying to make Lewis Hamilton the first ever rookie world driver champion, which, would have been absolutely incredible, actually, to think about it. But, wow, it was amazing to see how we unsettled Alonso. But we all know how that ended in terms of Fernando would part ways with McLaren at the end of the season. Hamilton's new teammate, Heikki Kovalainen, would come in, and it would mean that the full team's resources could be put behind Lewis Hamilton, and he certainly repaid them in 2008.
Yeah, didn't he just? And I think that's the thing that always stands out about great drivers, is that they have this ability to instantly be able to build a team around them. You look at Vettel at Red Bull, you look at even now with Charles Leclerc at Ferrari, they've immediately been able to create this atmosphere where the whole team is behind them and they see them as the future going forward. And obviously the fact that Lewis was able to, within that first season, to build that was quite special. And then obviously 2008 arguably was a more scrappy season for Hamilton than 2007. I think he probably made more mistakes. He didn't drive as cleanly in 2008 as he did in 2007, but as it turned out, probably because he had the fact that the whole team was with him, he was the clear number one driver, that probably made the difference in terms of him winning the World Championship that year and perhaps not in 2007.
Absolutely. I think F1 is a sport that shows in history that you unless you've got an unbelievable car, where you've got like the Mercedes, the MP44, where, the car is clearly so superior to anything else on the grid, then you have to pretty much have a clear number one status, because otherwise that in-team fighting tears you apart. You take points off each other in a title fight compared to someone else who might have a number one status, and they come in like Kimi Raikkonen did, although, it was close probably between Kimi and Massa in 2007, but Kimi was the one who had mounted the serious title charge, and he was there to kind of claim the rewards at the end of that 2017. But 2008, you're right, he only got on the podium 10 times in that, and he did win one more race, so that was probably more impressive. But, still 5 wins in your second season. So he's now racked up 9 wins in his first 2 seasons in F1, which is pretty impressive stats. But the Great British Grand Prix that year, I watched it back recently, and the commentary were around him. He was under a little bit of pressure actually coming into that British Grand Prix, because being a little bit scrappy, things hadn't been quite going Hamilton's way that season. Off the track stuff had been affecting him a little, and it was something that plagued Lewis Hamilton's career actually a little bit. I think he struggled to cope with the media pressure that was around him of being successful straight away. He didn't have a settling time in F1. He was in the spotlight right from day one. And, you know, the British Grand Prix was an absolute superb performance that kind of, I think for me, his first real kind of world. There'd been a few really good performances, but that performance in his home Grand Prix, under the pressure he was at that time, was just absolutely world class to say, I'm Lewis Hamilton, the hype's real, I'm a serious talent in F1 and I'm here to stay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you could even argue it, even now it's one of his greatest drives ever, even with all the great drives he's had since. I think obviously you mentioned the off track pressure. I think there was a little bit of on track pressure as well, because obviously on the Saturday he made a mistake in qualifying, so he didn't get a great starting position for the race. And obviously it kind of went from there. His start was unbelievable. His move on Kovalainen for the lead was fantastic. And yeah, it was one of those drives where you were sort of sat there. Obviously I was only 11 years old at the time, but you sort of sit there and you think, wow, I'm witnessing something truly special here, because, you know, there were times where he was 5 or 6 seconds a lap faster than the guys on the same tyres as him. And how often in the modern era of Formula One can you say that? I mean, you're counting on one hand. So it truly was something quite incredible. And I remember obviously the atmosphere as well, the fact that it was his home Grand Prix and those final few laps, the crowd sort of cheering him home, I think was just, it all added to what was arguably one of, if not the most, well, yeah, one of the most memorable British Grand Prix in history.
Yeah, and it was the fact for me that on those intermediates, only Rubens Barrichello really went faster in that race when he was on full wets in the torrential downpour that happened. But Lewis Hamilton, you know, he finished over a minute, I believe, ahead of second place in the end in that race, which was Nick Heidfeld in the end. And it was just like, how is he finding this much pace? And admittedly, I think I said we did a classic race review on it recently. You know, when you're out in front, you've only got to battle yourself, and that's still a tough battle. But, you know, in those conditions, you're not under pressure from anybody else making those mistakes, where obviously a lot of people were spinning behind him, but that's because all the racing was pretty close and someone's on the back of them and they're having to worry about someone else out back, someone else in front of them, where Lewis, pretty much as soon as he overtook Heikki Kovalainen, never had to worry about anybody else in that race. But it was still incredible what he did.
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially with the pressure of the fact that I think sometimes being so far in the lead as well sort of adds an extra pressure of like, I can't mess this up now. You know, I've got it in the bag. So it's obviously famously with Senna at Monaco at Portier when he crashed miles ahead of everyone. And I think that being the home Grand Prix, off the back of some difficult results, I think in those conditions, you don't want to underestimate just how difficult it was for him, even in clean air, to just maintain that unbelievable pace and the consistency. I think he only had one minor off in the whole race. And yeah, as you say, drivers like Felipe Massa were spinning like 5 times during the race. So it was, yeah, quite an unbelievable drive.
It was. And I think although it was scrappier in this season, and, you know, he really had that title fight with Massa, there are a few seasons through Formula One history where there's quite a lot you go, the guy who won it deserved it more than anybody else. But there are a few seasons where you go, well, if Felipe Massa had won that season, I don't think anyone would have been kind of going, that was undeserved. I think it was a really competitive and underrated title fight, probably, because of all the dominance that's come before. But yeah, that first victory, and, you know, with Glock slowing down at the end, and the famous, is that Glock slowing down? Is that Glock? From Martin Brundle. It's, I mean, for Massa fans, it's heartbreaking across the world. But for Lewis Hamilton, it was a dream that came true. And in his second season in Formula One, winning a World Drivers' title, I don't think we can understate how incredible that is. You know, just such a fresh-faced kid and just like, yeah, incredible.
Yeah, I mean, that race to me still is perhaps one of the greatest moments in Formula One history. I mean, it's sort of the Aguero moment of Formula One, so to speak. It's that moment where, you know, I think you sort of pinch yourself and think, did I really watch that? Obviously, I think at the time I was sort of torn, I think, in terms of who I wanted to support. Obviously, I was a big Ferrari fan all growing up, but you sort of got caught on the bandwagon as well of, obviously, it was Lewis Hamilton, it's your home country, all the newspapers, everything, you know, was behind him, and you got along with that hype. And I sort of remember when Vettel went past, I was like, he's blowed it, and I was sort of like, I was almost sort of gutted for him. I thought, there's no way he's going to do it now. And then obviously the Glock moment happened, and I think it's quite funny because I was watching it with my parents, and my dad missed it. He didn't realise that it was Glock, and he crossed the line thinking like, just like the Ferrari crew, that Massa had won the title. And I was like, no, that's Glock. Hamilton's won it. And I think that just sums up the chaos of that whole moment. I mean, obviously, I think James Allen and Martin Brundle called it brilliantly, but the sheer confusion and who won, did Lewis do it, and obviously that realization that Hamilton had achieved it. I don't know if we'll ever see a moment in Formula One like that again. It was truly unbelievable.
You think you would never, but you know, in this crazy sport, it's the sport that keeps giving you moments over and over again. But it is one of those truly special moments, and still years on. Well, a driver's first title is always special and is always remembered. But just in the manner of that, however cruel it was on Felipe Massa, you know, having done everything he could, for Lewis Hamilton to do it, on that last corner, it was amazing to kind of see how it all played out. But you know, he's gone from the highs of winning that championship, and then I think at that point, if you'd said, especially the cars that they'd given him in 2007, 2008, and go, you know what, it's not really going to work out for you for McLaren for the rest of your career. I think people would have been surprised, I think, probably by that. And it was a mix of, like, 2009, I think McLaren and Ferrari got caught out. They were looking ahead to the kind of 2010 rule changes and kind of ignored 2009. And obviously Brawn came in and, like we said, like we know, it got that fairy tale season. But, you know, 2010 and 2012 in particular for me, they had good cars. They had cars that were capable of winning a championship again. But they just kind of blew it in terms of reliability issues and mistakes from drivers and pit crews. It just kind of, it never really materialised for him again in the McLaren seat after 2008.
No, it didn't. And I think I don't think that was, well, for the most part, I don't think that was any fault of Lewis. I think Lewis's level probably grew from 2008 quite significantly through the next few years. I thought 2009 and 2010, I thought Lewis drove extremely well at times. And I think almost it gets underappreciated now, sort of those seasons, obviously, of what he's gone on to achieve since. But some of his drives in those years were superb. I think Canada 2010 was a fantastic race with him and Alonso battling for the win. I think that was one of his best drives. And obviously, as you say, I think it was more the flaws of McLaren as, you know, perhaps a sign of what was going to come in the next few years. Just some flaws in their overall management, you know, stupid mistakes in the pits, reliability, that really cost them a chance to really fight for the championship, because they weren't that far away. I think, especially in 2010, Hamilton still mathematically had a chance going into Abu Dhabi, I believe, of winning the championship, which kind of shows, you know, a couple more things here and there. He could have been the champion. Obviously, I think 2011 is a slightly different example. I think that's a case of where obviously the Red Bull was extremely dominant that year, but also Lewis wasn't quite on his game for whatever reason in that season, as he wasn't in the other years. But I think you could see the frustrations beginning to grow, because Lewis himself wasn't doing a whole lot wrong. You could see he was still that top tier talent that was capable of winning world championships.
Yeah, I think everyone knew it was in it, and yeah, that Canada race was an absolute brilliant. And Canada is funny as, you know, funny how Lewis has developed into that great multi-time champion in the wake of Michael Schumacher, and Michael was so good at Canada, and it's funny how, you know, Lewis has become so good at Canada as well. It almost seems like a second home for him. He always seems to find a good result there. One of, you know, the most successful drivers there of all time. And yeah, that 2010 season, it was a season where for the majority we had a five-way title fight. It was only Jenson Button that dropped off, I think with about 3 races to go. And yeah, Lewis was the least likely out of the 4 guys who could mathematically win it in the last race. But yeah, that must have been a really frustrating season. And yeah, 2011, it was by far superior, but it seemed a frustrated season for Lewis because him and Massa were like magnets to each other. They certainly collided on more than one occasion, and you know, a lot of people think the Mercedes days have done much for his reputation in terms of how it is. It was just racing incidents, but it certainly wasn't his best on an F1 track, and the performance he's put in, like you said, it was clear frustration, I think.
Yeah, 2011 was actually a very weird season because arguably 2 of his best ever races came in that season as well. I think the Chinese and the German Grand Prix that year were 2 unbelievable Hamilton wins. I think he drove like an absolute animal on those days and thoroughly deserved to win in a car that probably wasn't quick enough on either of those days to really deserve to win. But sort of Lewis willed it to victory, and yet there were other days in that season where you just thought, what's Lewis doing? I think Singapore probably is the one that stands out to me the most. I think just such a clumsy collision with Massa. Massa didn't do anything wrong on that occasion. Obviously, some of the others are more open to debate, but yeah, I think that was a moment where I was like, what's he doing? Like, it was a moment where I think people did start to question, well, is he as good as what we'd rated him before? Is he someone that can be a multi-time champion, or did he peak too early? And obviously, we found out the answer to that. But I think people were raising some serious questions that year.
Yeah, and then 2012 happened. McLaren gave a car, but unfortunately, I think both Lewis and Jenson talk about this. As a team, they seem to just overcomplicate things. They tried too many things. Like, they seem to change a load of things, you know, on the pit stops, trying to get a massive advantage in the pits, and it led to kind of mistakes, frustratingly through the season, collisions and things. I mean, obviously, we've just recently watched the European Grand Prix as the F1 Rewind, and, you know, having a bad pit stop in that, and then his tyres falling away drastically at the end there, and defending desperately for a podium, and him and Pastor Maldonado coming together in clashing blows. And that essentially just kind of summed up the season. There were plenty of kind of mechanical failures for Lewis as well in 2012, and it would turn out to be a defining season for me, because the car was capable, bar the reliability issues. If he won that title at McLaren, do we still talk about Lewis being at McLaren nowadays? I don't know.
I think it's possible. I don't think it could be ruled out. I think, as you say, it was such a weird season because they came to Australia and McLaren were dominant. McLaren were easily the fastest team. They knocked out the front row in qualifying. They won quite comfortably in the race, and you sort of think, wow, this could be Button versus Hamilton for the title this season. And yeah, just so many inter-team mistakes and just poor management. And I think if you had to almost pick one race as a tipping point of Lewis Hamilton's career, it'd be the 2012 Singapore Grand Prix, because there he was, dominant, you know, well on course to pick up the victory, and then the reliability goes, and you could see in that moment, I think people talk about it now as it was almost the moment where he was like, right, that's it, I'm done with McLaren, because you could just see the anguish on his face and the just sheer frustration that once again a victory that was in his hands was taken away from him for reasons that were not in his control. And obviously, I think a few weeks prior, Eddie Jordan had started the rumour mill that Lewis Hamilton was going to Mercedes, and everyone sort of laughed him off as if Lewis Hamilton going to Mercedes, not a chance. And then obviously, as things turned out, the announcement soon came that he was going to be there for 2013. I think everyone was absolutely shocked. I think everyone thought, what's he doing? That he's never going to win another championship now. I think people were starting to question it anyway. But yeah, I think it was sort of the seismic moment of the entire decade of Formula One was that decision.
Absolutely. And yeah, Singapore was the moment, I think, that broke Lewis. I mean, also he, shared the team telemetry on Twitter, I think it was, in that season, which, that I think McLaren were done with Lewis as well. There comes a time with these things that you can have a very talented team. Obviously, McLaren with their history, there's no doubting that they're a great team in Formula One. And recently, obviously, having come through the really turbulent years that they've been through, starting to rise back and get back to that team. But, they were a great team. Lewis clearly is a great racing driver, but for whatever reason after 2008, it never, materialised in becoming an effective relationship again. And a little bit of that is to do with the off-track stuff. I think Lewis definitely wasn't in a great place, and obviously his relationship with his dad deteriorated over that time, and, leading to a time where he wasn't really coming to the races. Obviously, they've now thankfully rebuilt that relationship, and the family and everything is so important to Lewis again now. But yeah, it was absolutely huge, and that move to Mercedes, having seen what Mercedes had achieved up until that point, and in 2012 was only the team's first ever victory.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everyone sort of expectations were pretty low for Lewis when he went to Mercedes. But I think even before 2014, I think even in 2013, people could start to see, oh, okay, Lewis is probably outsmarted us all already here, because immediately, obviously, McLaren had a disastrous 2013. They got it completely wrong. And Mercedes, despite their tyre issues, were able to pick up victories in that season. Obviously, Rosberg picked up a couple, I think, in Monaco and Silverstone. Hamilton probably should have won Silverstone if it wasn't for his own tyre issues there. And obviously, Lewis picked up that fantastic win in Hungary. And I think, in that first season, the fact that they were, as a team, were able to pick up 3 victories from where they were before that, and to be a fairly consistent threat. I mean, they had races where things went disastrously wrong. I think Spain was an absolute catastrophe for Mercedes. That one certainly stands out. But I think even in that first season, people could see that, okay, maybe there is a reason why Hamilton's gone to Mercedes. They are building something. They've got obviously they had Ross Brawn in 2013, but you could start to see that they're building this structure of a real team that could challenge for a world championship in the future. And then obviously with the regulations change, and that was when it all kicked off.
They certainly were. And also, I think the appeal, because I think we forget at this stage with how the relationship deteriorated, that Nico and Lewis, they were really great mates. Like, they really got on. They'd grown up, obviously, through karting with each other. I remember Nico's first podium. Lewis congratulates him, and it's just a joyous kind of embrace and hug. And I don't think that can be underestimated as well. That I think Jensen and Lewis got on well with each other, but Lewis and Nico, it's a no-brainer, isn't it? If you're wanting to go to a kind of happy place and start with a fresh start, why not go with your guy that you're a really good mate with in F1. But like you said, lose 3 wins, and then 2014 drops, and the hybrid, turbo hybrid era, I mean, it has literally just changed the game. And Mercedes have well and truly capitalised that. And the fact that 2014, you might not as well have turned up at a Grand Prix if you didn't have a Mercedes engine that year. They just nailed it so well, and it showed with those on-track performances, and obviously Lewis claiming his 2nd world title.
Yeah, it was quite unbelievable. I think, he sort of came to Melbourne, and obviously everyone knew that Mercedes had been dominant in testing, but I think it really painted a picture sort of that weekend. Obviously Hamilton had his issues in the race and had to retire, but even then, the way Rosberg just controlled the race, and obviously Bahrain, I think was the first time where people really realised, okay, Mercedes aren't just the fastest, they're the fastest by a country mile, because Lewis and Nico were able to have that unbelievable battle and yet still be 2-3 seconds a lap faster than anybody else in those final stages of the race. It was quite, obviously, I think they showed that on the F1 channel again the other day, and it was just insane to just look back on just how fast that Mercedes was, because, as I say, they were battling tooth and nail. It wasn't as if they were setting sort of the ultimate efficient lap times, yet they were still just miles clear of everyone else. It was like 2 different formulas, and obviously at that point you knew that it was just going to be a flat out war between Lewis and Nico for the world championship, and obviously the relationship started to deteriorate as a result.
Yeah, which I think is probably a shame for 2, but I think I saw Nico talking about it. And when you're going for a championship, you have to make compromises, and unfortunately your friendship has to get compromised, because I mean, look, it's a different world to what it's like in the 1950s, because the Mike Hawthorne, Peter Collins is probably an argument to say, well, you can be best mates and still go for a world title. And you know how they really got on, and they were really happy for when each other won. But I think in the modern world, in the modern professional world, with all the media and the pressure that comes with it, you can't be best mates with your teammate. You can have respect for them and everything, but at the end of the day, especially when you have a car as dominant as what the Mercedes was, yeah, you've got to look for every psychological advantage, and being best mates definitely isn't that case. And just remembering how dominant that guy... Lewis that season retired 3 times in 2014, and every other race he finished on the podium, which, is incredible. I think only, is it 2002 that Michael Schumacher finished literally every race on the podium that year, which, yeah, was, to have that level of consistency of performance, and yes, the car was beneficial to that, but yeah, hugely impressive.
Yeah, I think that was almost a bit of the story of the season, in that usually on most weekends where Hamilton didn't have any issues, he was the faster of the 2 drivers that year, but he did seem to get sort of a bit unlucky compared to Nico in terms of his reliability, not just in the races themselves, but obviously I think he had a few Hungary had a qualifying issue. I think obviously Germany had a crash in qualifying, but there were a few instances where he had to sort of come through the field as well, in order to get onto the podium. And it was sort of a season until, well, I suppose even I think Spa was sort of the tipping point of it. Obviously until that point, Lewis was sort of playing catch up to Nico. Every time he kind of got close, he'd have another issue, and then obviously their infamous Nico hit me guys at Spa, and at that moment I think a lot of people started to think, oh well, maybe this is going to be Rosberg's title, maybe it's just not meant to be for Lewis this year. But actually, as it turned out, it was the tipping point where actually Lewis then went on a run of victories and was able to pull that gap back in and go on and see and win the title in that infamous double points in Abu Dhabi.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely incredible after that Spa thing, because he won 6 out of 7 races, which that's enough to win you a title, and it did win him the title that year. And it was the start of the Hamilton-Rosberg rivalry, and I think, you know, with how it ended, obviously with Nico retiring off the sport, as fans were gutted because we've seen this amazing rivalry. You guys who were friends but have turned against each other and in team, and they were pushing each other each season, and it was a real excitement because no other team was matching them really on track. So it was really, you know, the title fight between Nico and Lewis which was giving us the excitement. And over those 4 years they raced together, and 3 years obviously with title fights and challenges, it was amazing to watch, and there were certainly some really high moments from it. In 2016 he came second, and I think that shook Lewis a little bit, because I would have just loved to have seen Lewis with another season with Nico to see how he came back from it after losing that World Championship. I have no doubt he probably, you know, would have fought back even harder because of the search for perfection that Lewis Hamilton does. But it was interesting, you know, those two become a 3-time world champion, and then he lost to Nico. And obviously a lot of people go with the reliability. Nico was lucky to win that title. No, nobody's lucky to win a world title. Like, Nico earned that title. With every slip up that happened to Lewis that season, Nico was there to take full advantage. And, you know, his previous couple of seasons, it hadn't gone Nico's way, but he more than took, you know, that opportunity when it came to him, you know, in Abu Dhabi in 2016. But it's been a brilliant rivalry. I really did enjoy the kind of friction between the Nico and Lewis rivalry.
I think it was needed. I think if you'd had that time period with Hamilton and Bottas, for instance, from 2014 to 2016, I think that whole era would have been looked on very, very differently to how it is, because obviously the fact that the rivalry between the two of them was so intense and the title battles were so close, it added that extra layer and almost made you forget that, okay, Mercedes are miles clear of everyone else. Obviously, Ferrari had their moments here and there, Red Bull had their moments here and there, but by and large, Mercedes were the team to beat every single weekend quite comfortably. And if you had a situation like we have now at Mercedes, where there was a clear number one, and as much as Bottas wants to be that number one, you know, he isn't quite on Lewis's level. Certainly not to the extent that Rosberg was. Rosberg pushed him so much extremely hard. And I think, as you say, that rivalry really ensured that we got some really good moments and some really good seasons out of that dominance.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Obviously, would it have been looked on differently with Bottas? I'm inclined to agree with you that it would do, because what Nico had in his advantage was he'd been there from day one with Mercedes. So that helped massively in his battle with Lewis, because Lewis was the one who came in fresh in 2013. And then it was neck and neck with each other, as well as Nico Rosberg, in my opinion, being a better driver than Valtteri Bottas. But I think that's probably agreed by most people. But Valtteri, you know, coming in to Lewis's team then, with Nico retiring. Look, Valtteri doesn't want to be compliant. He's a racing driver. He wants to win. But he's also very aware of this opportunity that he's got. And look, we don't know what he'll do in 2020 and how he'll do. I don't think he'll take it as laying down as he has done in these previous years. But I think he's realised that he can still have his name in the history books with the Mercedes Constructors titles, and helping the team itself becoming one of the best, if not the best team in Formula One history. And I think he's appreciated that moment of being part of the team, a bit like Rubens Barrichello did with Michael Schumacher. But 2016 ended, and it saw the start of the rivalry on track between Sebastian and Lewis. And obviously, you know, we hadn't really in the Red Bull days had a proper title fight between Lewis and Seb. And you can argue with 2017 and 2018 how the seasons played out, that we didn't really have a serious title fight between them there. But Seb was the closest competitor to Lewis during this time. And I think this time showed how good Lewis was at capitalising on an advantage and getting in his opponent's head. And obviously the prime example of that is Baku 2017.
I think that was a moment that surprised me. I think obviously Sebastian, we've always known he sort of had a little bit of a petulant side to him, obviously with Multi 21 and in Malaysia in 2013, and there were signs that okay, he has that side to him, but to actually see him, obviously, whether Hamilton deliberately was trying to play games, who really knows? I don't think it was quite how Sebastian thought it was at the time, and for him to drive up alongside and whack Hamilton's car and make the gestures he did, it was sort of a moment where you thought, blimey, that's quite out of character, that's quite out of hand. You wouldn't, Sebastian's not, you wouldn't expect to see him do that. And I think, as you say, the fact that Hamilton almost sort of brought that out of him, brought that out just because the pressure was so intense. Sebastian knew that he had a car that was certainly for the first half of the season capable of challenging Hamilton for the championship, and he felt, right, this is my chance to win that title for Ferrari. But obviously, as it turned out, with just Hamilton's pure consistency, and I think that's the real story of the last few seasons for me with Hamilton, is that consistency, that he just doesn't really have a bad day, or when he has a bad day, he sort of minimises damage of it, barring one or two races in this entire period. And I think that's what's really, really shone through for Hamilton in these last few seasons.
Yeah, I think his 2017 to 2019 period has been defined by that consistency. And you can argue at times the Mercedes certainly wasn't the clear dominant car that it had been between 2014 and 2016. The Ferrari had definitely been a lot closer, and at the back end of some of those seasons, Red Bull had probably had the best car on the grid. And it was just, he almost had that Prost-esque capabilities in this last part of the season, where he just does enough to get the result that he needs to. He doesn't, in his early Lewis days, I would say he was an exciting, vibrant driver. You'd love to see him in the overtakes. That was something that I think defined his early career for me, and he was a really exciting driver to watch. And that's not saying that Lewis Hamilton isn't an exciting driver to watch now. But I think he's just a very clever, and he drives with a lot of kind of guile now, in terms of, I know what I need to do to win this race. I know that I've got a great team behind me. I think his belief in the team in Mercedes is massive in this confidence that he has as well. But he just gets the job done week in, week out. He's so good, I think, at seeing the long picture now rather than the race to race. Obviously, all the drivers talk about going, we're just going to look ahead to this weekend. We'll look ahead to this race. But I think Lewis, in his post-2016 days, he's been masterful of almost plotting, like going, okay, we lost it a little bit this weekend, but I'm going to minimise the damage and make sure that we're on it next weekend, and never letting things get on top of him, which makes a great champion and why he's currently sitting on 6 world titles.
Yeah, and I think you raised a good point in terms of the trust as well, because perhaps that is a reason why we've seen those two different sides of Lewis, perhaps comparing the McLaren days to the Mercedes days, because obviously at McLaren, with the errors that we discussed, perhaps he didn't have that full belief in the team, certainly not that he has now at Mercedes, and perhaps that's why at some Grand Prix we saw him being a little bit petulant, making a few immature moves that you would not see from now, not looking at the bigger picture. And again, as you say, because now he knows that if Mercedes have a bad day, obviously we look at Germany 2019 as a very famous one, where Mercedes just got it. It just was a complete catastrophe for them that weekend. But Lewis, he was disappointed, but he knew that next weekend they'd be bang on it again. And obviously, I think that would have been the Hungarian Grand Prix, and obviously Lewis charged down Max and won that race. And I think his belief in the team, knowing that they'll bounce back, helps to fire that belief in himself even more. And as you say, it's just incredible now, that ability to just almost ease to the championships. I mean, obviously 2017 and 2018, certainly, as I say, the first half of the season, Ferrari are there. But in 2019, you sort of knew by June, well, that's it. Hamilton's going to win the championship. There's no one's going to catch him. And that's very reminiscent of the Schumacher days, that you sort of knew by round 5 or 6, Michael's going to win the world championship. And that's probably what stands out to me most, is that Lewis has created this air of invincibility that in my lifetime I'd only ever seen with Schumacher. I don't think any other driver, Alonso, Vettel, Raikkonen, any of them were able to build that air of invincibility in the same way that Hamilton and Schumacher have.
Absolutely not. And that is a really important point, actually. It has his level of dominance. People, very rare do you get a time where you just go, oh, I'm expecting so-and-so to win. Obviously, in the Senna and Prost days, it was, oh, it's going to be either Senna or Prost today, unless their car retires, because that car was so good. But with how Michael and how Lewis developed their legacies throughout, you're just like, it's another season, Michael's probably going to win today. Lewis has that. It's like, Lewis will probably take pole, Lewis will probably win, blah, blah, blah. 2019 was actually quite lucky with the emergence of those young talents in Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen, and really kind of raising a new challenge. Obviously, Max we've been aware of for a few years, but it was still nice. That was nice to see him mature and really kind of put on a serious challenge with Lewis. But Lewis Hamilton's career, there are more things to being a good F1 driver than being an F1 driver on the track, if that makes sense. And I think Lewis has mastered that. Like Schumi, he's mastered the psychological games over his opponents. He's proven in this career that he can beat them in the mental fight upstairs. I mean, Nico Rosberg literally had to give absolutely everything he got, to the point of exhaustion, of retiring at the end of the season, because he was like, I don't think it's going to get better than beating Lewis Hamilton. And that's an incredible mark on the driver. Obviously, other than Michael Schumacher, there's been no other driver who's had more success than Lewis Hamilton. His records speak for himself. The legacy he's created in the sport is incredible. And, he came up against a generation of drivers in Kimi Raikkonen, in Fernando Alonso, Sebastian Vettel, and himself, 4 incredibly talented drivers. And you can argue either way in their primes and stuff who might actually have been the better on track. But Lewis is the most complete F1 driver because he understands everything that goes in the sport, and he's mastered pretty much every single aspect of the sport, in my opinion. But one of the main guys who are a big influence on that is Niki Lauda. And I think Niki Lauda is a seriously defining moment in Lewis Hamilton's career, because having someone like that take you under his wing, I just think it was a sounding board. There's not many times you get in F1 someone who completely understands what you're doing in an F1 car, but is 100% behind you being successful, like Niki was for Lewis.
Yeah, and it's that relationship's quite interesting, because I was reading an article the other day, and it was Lauda talking about Hamilton back in 2011, and he actually got quite a lot of backlash for how critical he was of Lewis. But I think it was that frustration that he could see that if you put the right resources around him, put the right people behind Hamilton, that he was something special. He was something, and Lauda knew that. That's why Lauda obviously was a big influence in Lewis joining Mercedes and becoming part of that dynasty that they've built. And I think what stands out to me as well with their relationship is that I think Nicky's helped Lewis to almost win the right way. I think Lewis is very, very proud of the fact that he doesn't, by and large, he doesn't race people dirty. He always gives people space. He always, whereas Michael Schumacher, there's obviously that controversy. If anyone went to try and overtake Michael, he'd be swiping left, he'd be swiping right. He would push the boundaries to the very, very limit. But with Hamilton, there's that ability on track to actually, I'll race you as hard as I can, but I'll be fair. If you overtake me, you overtake me. Obviously, Verstappen at Brazil overtook him a couple of times. We've seen Charles Leclerc be able to beat him at Monza, and Hamilton's always been grateful in defeat. He's not questioned. He's sort of said, the better man won on the day, but knowing in his mind that he'll come back to the next race and he'll be back on game. He'll be ready to win again. I think that's something that has certainly formed in recent years since him and Nicky became close. And obviously now Lewis very much races with Nicky's legacy in his mind. And obviously I think he'll always now be have a special place in Lewis's heart.
Yeah, and you can tell how much he meant to him with that tribute where obviously, sadly in 2019, we lost Nicky from the paddock, and yeah, it was a sad day for F1, but you could tell it was a sad place for Lewis and Mercedes as a team. And I think what I love the most about Nicky and Lewis's partnership is the fact that a lot of us fans as F1, we obsess about the guy in the car. We obsess about the drivers. They're the stars of the show. They're the ones who are kind of in the face of the camera. They're our heroes that we go, wow, amazing what these guys do. But it showed for me that it emphasises even more that F1 is a team sport. Yes, Lewis Hamilton is that tip of the iceberg, but there is a whole kind of, glacier almost underneath the water, underneath it all, that helps get Lewis in that minor frame. And there are a few people around Lewis that have crafted him into the person he was today and the champion that he is today, where he just pushes the boundaries and has just refined everything to, like you said, Nicky seeing that special, that raw diamond in 2011 and almost, refining it into what he's become today. It's incredible. But yeah, Nicky, would Lewis have been the same without Nicky? I don't think so. I think he still would have been incredibly successful. That there is never taking any doubt behind Lewis Hamilton, but I think having that someone that he could just rely on to give him masterful advice and to be that sounding board and a true... I think it's rare in life you find people who will give everything to you being successful, and Nicky struck me as that type of guy, and that must have been a great boost for Lewis in his career.
Yeah, I think especially because early on in his career he didn't perhaps have the support network that he needed. Obviously he had his dad there for him as much as he could, but obviously we know that their relationship was up and down. It was rocky. He had his other issues in his personal life, and it almost seems to coincide that when Nicky came into Lewis's life, actually we stopped hearing about all of the off-track dramas, all of Lewis's personal life. And actually now, obviously Lewis's private life is exactly that. It's very private. We get occasional posts on social media that are very brand focused, they're very sort of PR friendly, but actually, just like with Sebastian Vettel, people don't really know that much about the Lewis Hamilton behind the scenes away from the F1 paddock now. Whereas I think in those McLaren days, we saw everything of Lewis's moves. He was in the newspapers every single day. We saw his relationship with Nicole was extremely public, and throughout time, that's that's all really, really drifted away, and it's arguably coincided with the dominance and the just unbelievable driver that he's formed into.
Yeah, and I think the way we'll round off this discussion on Lewis is through what he's achieved. Rightly, he is now in the question. Is he the greatest of all time? Is he certainly one of the greatest F1 drivers of all time, in opinion? And for me, his career's not done yet. So it'll be interesting to see how it kind of plays out in these last years. Will he break all the records? Will he statistically be the greatest driver of all time? We can only wait and see on that one. We don't know how the likes of the mercurial talents of Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc, like they're the Kimi Raikkonens and Fernando Alonso's to his Michael Schumacher. And it'll be interesting to see how quickly they rise, and can Ferrari and Red Bull give them serious title challenging cars that will make Lewis sweat a little bit more than he's needed to on track, because certainly in the last 3 years those teams haven't built competitive cars to mount a serious challenge over the course of a season. So it'll be interesting that. But for you, in the greatest of all time, where does Lewis Hamilton sit for you, Jason?
It's always, I think, extremely tricky because it's so hard to compare between the different eras. I think what is very clear is that Lewis Hamilton is the best of his generation by, I'd say a fair distance. As Sebastian Vettel's had a fantastic career. Fernando Alonso is a brilliant driver. I think it would be disrespectful to take away from them. But Lewis is for sure the greatest of his generation. And then when you compare him to other generations, I think the important thing, as you say, is that his career's not finished yet. And I think what could be massive for Lewis in terms of people saying, okay, perhaps he is the greatest we've ever seen, is that if he can successfully stave off the challenge of Verstappen and Leclerc for a few years and continue to be the dominant figure in Formula One, that I think makes his legacy even stronger, because then it harms the legacy of the likes of Verstappen and Leclerc if they're not able to get on top of Hamilton. People will always say, well, they only became, or whoever else comes along, be that Russell, whatever, they only came along because Lewis retired. I think that could be something that, obviously, with Michael, Fernando and Kimi came along and they did start to push him, and obviously the car was a factor in all of that. But certainly in 2006, the Ferrari and Renault, there wasn't a huge amount between them, but Alonso was able to really, really, really push Schumacher. And if we see that from Verstappen or Leclerc against Hamilton in the next couple of years, then perhaps we stave off from saying he's the greatest ever. But actually, if he goes on and wins another couple of championships and fights them off, I think it becomes hard to argue against him being the greatest ever. And obviously, as a huge Schumacher fan, that's not easy to say, but I think he has the opportunity to write a legacy that we've never seen before.
Yeah, and it's going to be fascinating to see on that front. And I think you're right. For me, it will be. I mean, I know you're a big Charles fan as well, but I just feel for that extra experience. While Lewis is in the sport, I think Max Verstappen will be the serious one who kind of challenges Lewis and will push him right to the brink. And which way of that will fall may, decide which side of, the fence everything falls on. But it will always be a close one for me between him and Michael Schumacher. I think I often use the term of the phrase where Michael wedges it for me at the moment is Lewis is a very big and important cog in that smooth running Mercedes machine, but at Ferrari, Schumacher built the machine for me. Not many people could do what he did at Ferrari to, grab them and drive them into being the successful outfit they were in the way that they were, where you could argue with Mercedes, a lot of the processes were put in place before Lewis got there. And that isn't like taking anything away with him, because he still has to have the amazing once in a generation talent to do what he's done at Mercedes. But that is just, when you talk about how great these guys are, it's the fine little margins that go in it. But one thing's for sure, Lewis Hamilton, and we are nearing the end of his time. I don't see him racing into his 40s like Kimi. He has other projects and other passions that he'd love to pursue in life, and I'm excited for him to see where that takes him. But in this sport, it's been incredible, and we have that sense of Sebastian retiring at the end of the 2020 season, and it won't be soon for Lewis. And when these guys who have dominated the last decade of Formula One retire, it's been incredible to watch Lewis Hamilton's career, and he, has made the sport that we love better and taken it to a new level. And I think that's the shout of a great champion as well, where you kind of feel like their ability takes the sport to another level to what it was before them, and what he's achieved with Mercedes certainly has done that.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. You become the face of the sport in such a way. I think that's what stands out about only a select few people in the history of sport. Ayrton Senna had that aura of around the world. It was the famed Ayrton Senna. You had that with Michael Schumacher, that even in places that you didn't really know what Formula One was, you kind of knew who Michael Schumacher was. And Lewis Hamilton is a name that's been able to create that as well. Around the world, people know, oh, Lewis Hamilton, he's that racing driver that wins all the time. And it sounds silly, but that shows just how strong his legacy is, and just how big a void it will be when he does retire, whenever that is. That's a huge, just as when Schumacher retired. Someone's going to have to come along. Will it be Verstappen? Will it be Leclerc? Will it be someone else? Is going to have to come on and pick up that mantle from Lewis and continue to drive the sport forward. I'm incredibly excited for the future, but there's no doubt that Lewis will be a massive, massive loss when he retires, because you just don't see talents and just that whole complete package that Lewis Hamilton is come along in any sport very often. And I think that's what makes Lewis one of the greatest sportsmen of all time. You can talk about within the chasms of Formula One, but also just within the whole chasm of sport itself. Lewis Hamilton in the 21st century is a name that's renowned with global sport. That's how powerful it is.
Certainly, and you can arguably make a very good case that Lewis Hamilton is maybe the best British sportsman ever. To think of a single guy who has dominated on the world stage and been a champion 6 times, the second highest, world drivers titles in the history of the sport. And like we said in this, it's not done that. He might, by the end of it, be outright the highest ever in history, which is incredible for a lad from Stevenage and his humble beginnings, to kind of come from. And we'll round off with Lewis here, and it's been a great, enjoyable chat, kind of reliving. And I think what really attracts me and grows on me over the years, I admit, my love of Lewis has kind of fluctuated throughout McLaren days. I really enjoyed it, and then obviously it got tense with the off-track stuff, wasn't particularly appealing. When it went to Mercedes, he still was maturing into the guy that he is today. But at this point, there is nothing but utter and huge respect for what he's done for the sport and what he's achieved in it. And yeah, it is incredible looking back at this journey, and it is a very human journey. It hasn't been a smooth road. Yes, he went into a championship winning car from the first season, but it certainly hasn't been an easy ride in every season in Formula One. And it's incredible what he's done.
Yeah, the way he's been able to rebound from some of the lows, obviously the incredible highs, and as you say, I mean, I think as a kid, you kind of looked at Schumacher's 7 titles, 91 victories. You sort of thought, well, is that ever? Are we ever going to see something like that again? And the fact that Lewis come along and basically has done the same again, I think that's something that's truly remarkable and should never be understated. And yeah, the fact he's been able to have those really low periods in his life and his career, I think he's often spoken himself of the demons he's had in his head in the past, and the way that he's been able to channel all of that into becoming this just phenomenon that he is. I think that's what makes his legacy just unbelievable.
Yeah, and Jason, thank you for, well, first of all, coming back, and congratulations on winning the quiz to earn this prize. But it was nice to kind of get you back and chat on anyway. It is always enjoyable talking F1 with you, and we're just kind of massive F1 fans and just kind of geek out for an hour on it. And it's not, well, it is quite funny going from the contrast of your Ferrari love to just arguably, you know, one of the main rivals to your team, well, the main rival to your team, and just the utter respect that you have to have for him. So thank you so much for coming on, Jace.
Thank you for inviting me back on. It's been a pleasure, as you say. It's been nice to sort of look at perhaps a driver that from a more neutral perspective. I think it's been quite enjoyable, and yeah, really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and guys, if you're new around here or you haven't done so already, you can subscribe to the channel and you can keep up with these F1 Worldwide, the fan podcast, through the whole of the kind of Corona break. They stay on after that as well. But, you know, every Saturday at 6 p.m, we get a different guest on to chat about another great F1 topic, and really enjoyed this one today. Last week we had the enigma of Roman Grosjean, and I think we go to the other end of the scale of someone who has mightily capitalised on his ability in the sport and really made the most of it. But that's it from me and Jason here today, guys. So for now, you F1 fans, keep racing.